All right, and that leads us very well into our discussion today. And this touches on agritech, but also the issue of gender and the gaps that we're experiencing. And of course, in studio, I have Rhoda Maina, who's a senior gender specialist, researcher, and social anthropologist at Marcy Coles AgriFin. Welcome to the show once more. You had set the ground very well, Rhoda. You had spoken about the disparity. Majority of the smallholder farmers, still a good portion actually are women. And I see a correlation where if at all you address the women needs within the smallholder farming, then you are solving actually the larger discussion about food security. Maybe we'll revisit that conversation a little bit. This gender parity, does it even trickle down to when you talk about agriculture and technology?
Absolutely. In fact, I'd probably flip that to say that it trickles up to agricultural technology. Mm-hmm. The disparity, of course, is manifested in different ways. For example, you'll see a higher concentration of women at the lower end of the agricultural value chain, and more likely to be in subsistence farming, which is, not for sale, not for profit, and so forth, versus men and male farmers who are more likely to be, higher up in the value chain, which is more, of course, economically, positive and so forth, and more stable and more diverse in terms of the agricultural activities. The issue around technology, of course, which is an enabler, and the disparity between the uptake, access and uptake and adoption of technology services within agriculture stems from several gendered factors. For instance, low-income women especially are more likely to have lower digital literacy, for example, which of course will then have an impact on their sort of usage of technology. Access to information, it has also been seen as a gendered issue and a gendered challenge. Access to finance, of course, and assets and other financial barriers, issues such as land ownership and so forth means that you've got limited sort of credit or credit opportunities, for instance, which of course then inherently has an impact on what women and women farmers, especially low-income women farmers, as I mentioned earlier, are able to engage with, and to what capacity they're able to engage with and adopt agritech solutions, services, and so forth.
Definitely. So it touches on key pain points. When you talk about financing, owning land ownership, these areas that as a country, we tend to think we've come a long way, but there's still more to be done in that regard. Because, for example, financing, that seems to be a huge factor even when it comes to incorporating agri-technology. And you're saying the gender disparity is showcasing so heavily in that. What are some of the solutions that we're looking at here to make sure that these gaps are sort of reduced for the overall benefit of the agricultural value system?
There are the different solutions which have been tried and tested. There's some which are still being piloted and so forth, and some which have, demonstrated, positive shifts in gender inequalities and etc. From the access to finance, for instance, we are still very recently seeing the adoption of alternative credit scoring as a tool to create a more inclusive environment when it comes to assessing creditworthiness. So rather than formal financial institutions who would historically or traditionally look at collateral such as land, what are the types of credit scoring markers or indicators could you use, which would then obviously support or open up the opportunities for women who are less likely to own their land. So the alternative credit scoring is something that has been viewed as quite a strong approach that can factor in different gendered barriers, for instance, as well as it's not necessarily even just about gender, but we are speaking about gender now, in trying to create more inclusive financial instruments and opportunities, which also look at youth, for instance, and the youth demographic who might have limited credit reference. They might not have been engaging in transactional and financially transactional activities for, of course, someone who's a little bit older, which then might make them less attractive to formal financial institutions. Of course, we have with a degree of success, financial financing being provided by non-financial institutions, which might be microbanks and micro-lending institutions, for instance. More investment in SACCOs and other informal financial institutions and instruments, which have also provided an alternative avenue with more preferable lending rates, for instance, and repayment periods and so forth, which are not as stringent as, say, the ones from formal financial institutions.
Definitely. That's very, very important. Alternative credit scoring. It's very critical because that's one of the biggest barriers that we've been experiencing using the old model. And it becomes almost impossible even to be considered. And I'm glad that that is something that is being looked into. At the same time, I don't know how open, especially the traditional financial institutions are to some of these suggestions, because also finance is evolving very much and very quickly. And you've spoken about alternatives because they're coming up very quickly, targeted lending. There are even grants, different areas that people can explore to get financing, which is quite interesting. I want to take a short break. And even on the financing bit, I'll be so much interested to know how these smallholder farmers can position themselves better to take advantage of different vehicles that we have around as we discuss this particular issue. Remember, it's the Farm Kenya show, and we're talking about the issue of the smallholder farmer and merging it closely with agritech, but looking at the marginalization that is being faced, especially with women and also the youth, and how we can seal these gaps. We take a short break, still more to come. Keep it Farm Kenya, keep it KTN. Welcome back to the Farm Kenya show. We are discussing matters to do with agriculture sector, especially the smallholder farmer, because we understand that if at all you are to solve the food crisis and food security crisis, you have to intervene with the smallholder farmer category. But in between that, there are challenges. One of them is, of course, the gender issue that we have women who've been sidelined, whereas they protect when it comes to majority of the primary production of the food that we eat each and every single day. But other than that, also, we're talking about technology and how it can be a vehicle for transformation. And in studio, I have Rhoda Maina, who's a senior gender specialist, researcher and social anthropologist at Massey Coles Agrifin. And Rhoda, there is need, because there is need for concerted effort and all hands being on deck, because you can be solving a problem from one side and on the other side it's sort of leaking. It's always important to have all players on board. So when you talk about financing, finance sector players should be on board. When you talk about technology, tech players should come on board. And bringing all these people under the same roof sometimes can be quite a challenge, but also there is intentionality. Talk to me about early. And how it is a solution, and what goal is it aiming to achieve to solve this problem of gender issues within our agricultural sector?
Thank you. Mercy Corps Agrifin's yearly annual learning event brings together, as you mentioned, multi-sectoral actors. So, as you said, we've got the financial institutions, donors, funders, investors. We have the digital and technology organizations as well, and innovators, research institutions, of course, and think tanks, and policymakers, and government representatives. And of course, let's not forget agritech organizations as well, who are at the forefront of delivering products and services for different communities.
Yeah, that's quite critical, because when everyone is on board, then there is a particular way that you can forge a way forward to attack some of these areas. And even the financing bit, as you had mentioned earlier, there is innovation, there is change. To make sure that this sector is evolving to cater to these needs. How has especially the traditional finance systems, have they embraced this new way of asking them, for example, can you develop an alternative credit score to cater for this segment of the market? Is this something that has been welcome, or is it a lot of tussle?
I would say that there's been interest, and interest in even piloting, some of these innovative approaches, such as alternative credit scoring. And this is an occurrence across the world, particularly in low and middle income countries, and so not just Africa, for example. I think one of the shifts, of course, is one of the things, the key things is buy-in. Really, how are we making a business case for what the relevance is, what and how is this a financially viable approach and a profit-making approach to adopt, and also how are we addressing any potential risks in this new model. Of course, financial institutions rely on tried and tested, approaches and so forth within their organizations, the systems and processes, the focus areas, and etc. And I think what we're discovering more is that it's really how you package this, and how we're looking at this as an opportunity to build economic resilience for scaling and growth and sustainability as a long-term game. And with that and bearing that in mind, it's also looking at what alternative credit scoring or even alternative data can do to support the focus areas or the strategies of financial institutions. How does alternative data, for instance, inform the products and services that financial institutions are developing? How can they inform, future-proofing or future planning or so forth in the types of services and to build sustainability as well.
Okay.
So the models for instance, alternative credit scoring can also be a combination or culmination of other types of tools,
Okay.
which makes it a more attractive offer for financial institutions. So there is traction, it is being tested and piloted, and really now it's to see how we can ensure or get enough buy-in for scaling.
Okay.
Across more financial institutions.
And, okay.
Yeah.
And when it comes to design, especially when you talk about agtech, should they be very particular when designing agtech to cater to the marginalized? When we talk about women being marginalized within our agricultural sector, the youth being marginalized, when you talk about developing agtech, is it something that should be very specifically catered towards the marginalized within the group?
Absolutely. And there are many reasons for this. From a commercial perspective, and I'll start with that, is that it means that you're building products and services that can then build sustainability. In terms of profit making and so forth, it also ensures that they can be scalable as well, because they have been tailored to different audiences and target groups' needs and specific needs. Understanding the needs specifically, again, of low-income women, for instance, or for youth, and for men as well, has to come from an understanding of what their context is, what challenges and barriers are very specific to them, whether it's within the communities and so forth. How do we map social cultural norms and the impact of that on the uptake and usage of agri-tech, for instance? How do we map it to the economical stability or financial status? Mm-hmm. How do we map it to geography? So, for instance, developing agri-tech solutions in hard-to-reach rural areas where infrastructure might be an issue as well. How do we develop these based on the type of agriculture or other activities that the individuals might be undertaking? Mm-hmm. So having an understanding of those different multiple characteristics, including age as well, which either create barriers or unequal sort of bias or representation when it comes to products, solutions, design is absolutely important.
Yeah. And in terms of the impact, because sometimes we talk about interventions, and if it has not been tried before, then you're speaking by faith. But if it is something that has worked in a microcosm, it's something that can be scaled, as you talked about earlier. So talk to me about, if at all we make these interventions, utilizing technology, refining our financial systems to cater to women and the youth who are marginalized, what impact, what change will we see within our food value system and our agricultural sector?
I would say that the impact that should be expected from more targeted interventions for, say, women and youth would be increase in job opportunities, an increase in knowledge production as well. An overall increase in food security and sustainability. And, something that's also quite important, especially in the geographical context that we exist within, is the ability to be able to be resilient during unexpected shocks. Such as environmental shocks, droughts, floods, and so forth. One of the biggest factors of food insecurity is unexpected shocks, or sure, expected shocks, but without any sort of enabling system to be able to support low-income farmers. We're increasingly, of course, seeing that, particularly within low-income households, that women are the primary breadwinners, which, of course, then increases, their roles and responsibilities when it comes to the stability of the household, nutrition, education, and so forth. So when we're thinking about the role that women play, for instance, it's quite important to also understand what their responsibilities are within the household and outside of the household as well. With youth, we've got an opportunity to really harness the fact that they're more digitally savvy, for instance. And when we're talking about the design of agritech, when we're looking at, for instance, the design of climate smart solutions and technologically driven solutions, youth can play quite a critical role in ensuring that we're diversifying, opportunities such as artificial intelligence and how that's utilized to increase efficiency and boost productivity, for example.
Mm-hmm. That's very important to be able to actually know the impact that when you make a particular intervention, the ripple effect, not only in the agriculture sector, but also in the household, which is quite critical. And this marries into the bigger conversation about food security in the country. Oftentimes, I think it's a discussion that has long been politicized, so it will be part and parcel of campaign manifestos at the end of the day. But the reality is that we have a lot of work to do on the ground. You've spoken about, unprecedented, unexpected shocks. One of the biggest one has been, the climatic changes that we're experiencing, especially as a continent. We've been on the receiving end. So I'm wondering, when we make these interventions on a larger scale as a nation, as a region, when you talk about sub-Saharan Africa, what will this do to our status of food security and even a ripple effect when you talk about the economy of this region?
I would say that it would increase food security for one key reason, in that more efficiency, more access and increased access, whether it's to products and services, whether it's into machinery, as you mentioned, and so forth, then that, of course, has a knock-on effect on productivity as a whole. Of course, we'll see that then, that will also help increase trade, not only within countries, for instance, but also cross-border trade. But of course, we also need to understand that there are other external factors which can or cannot influence or inform food security as the final sort of result or expected outcome. For instance, policies and regulatory measures which are favorable for low-income farmers, for instance, access to and provision of training and capacity building and so forth, and other resources. Access to extension officers, for instance, as mentioned earlier in this segment, and making and actually investing resources and an intentional focus on looking at all these enablers and being very, very clear and specific about what are the roles and responsibilities of the decision makers within this space? How is the allocation of funding and resources designed and developed with always the end user in mind, which would be low-income farmers, for instance, and with youth. And we talk a lot about public participation, for instance, and when we're designing anything, whether it's a policy, whether it's a product or services, or any type of solution, without actually employing a human-centered approach where the person at the core is the target audience, the target individual, and engaging with those communities as well to understand what their needs are, what their challenges are, but then also what their aspirations are, to ensure that we're not making broad-based assumptions, whether that's at a community level, or at a national level, or at a regional level, about what people's priorities are. And this, of course, will lead to food security as one aspect, more stable and resilient households and businesses.
Okay. And using your analogy of flipping things around, because you've spoken a lot of interventions towards these marginalized groups and what needs to be done towards them. For the farmers themselves, for the women, for the youth themselves who are in agriculture, what role do they play to position themselves better, to be able to uptake agritech that is coming up, but also access other opportunities, for example, when it comes to financing, which is quite critical, and whatnot?
I'm going to be very careful by saying that it's less about the role that they play, but then the opportunity and the avenues and the pathways given to them to be able to make them or improve or increase their access. Because the will may be there, but the ability to actually act on it may not be. Being more creditworthy, for instance, or being, a more viable candidate for financial institutions. We've seen that, for an entrepreneur, for example, financial status is, of course, economic status is one aspect, but we know that's pretty low for low-income farmers and for youth farmers as well. But business training and business literacy is also something that financial institutions look at. We've seen very many interventions, for instance, whereby a low-income woman, for example, will be prioritized for business loans or grants and so forth. However, her ability to actually utilize that money effectively to be able to start and grow her business and maintain it would tend to be a lot lower if she had not had business training and business literacy, for instance. So we look at, rather than just one stream of a requirement, so to speak, in terms of, say, financial literacy or financial status and so forth. It's also about, what makes you a viable candidate, not just for the present, but then also for the long term as well. And, again, there, it's also about, how device usage and increasing the ability to build their educational literacy, for instance. It might be through vocational courses, entrepreneurial courses, and so forth, to also demonstrate the capability, but then also the will as well.
Definitely. That's very, very important. Wow. When we talk about agriculture, food security, smallholder farmers, these we can speak about for days, but I'm glad we've covered key touch points that need to be brought to light and interventions that are being made in that regard. I know earlier on you had mentioned you're having an annual learning event, 9th edition for AgriFin. Also, I think that is an area that brings everyone, every stakeholder under the same roof to be able to deliberate, because you've said policy needs to change to favor, the smallholder farmer and whatnot. But thank you very much for your time, Rhoda. I really appreciate you making time, and also AgriFin at large for being part of Farm Kenya today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Rhoda Maina is Senior Gender Specialist, Researcher, and Social Anthropologist with extensive experience in Sub-Saharan Africa. Pharmacy calls Agrifin. That's where we put a full stop to today's show. I hope you've seen how much needs to be done to make sure that our smallholder farmers are thriving and that impacting our food security. Thank you very much for being part of this show of the past 1 hour. My name is Nokip Kimboy. Keep it KTN and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Tufanye kazi pamoja na tukue pamoja.